Hey everyone, welcome to the Steadfast Podcast. Thank you for joining us today as we go through PTSD. PTSD sounds very overwhelming. It stands for post traumatic stress disorder. It is a mental health condition that you can get from a reaction to a traumatic event, such as a car accident, a hurricane, war zones. You hear a lot of PTSD, I think, with veterans and military and first responders. Statistics show that 6% of the total population have PTSD. And again, with statistics, and we need to remember that that's what's reported, and that's those that meet the actual criteria for PTSD, not just having some of the symptoms of PTSD, full criteria and what's reported. 6%, but that's total world population. So is this treatable? PTSD is treatable. Um, I I envision PTSD and what it does to your emotional system is like from the Star Wars movie when Han Solo gets frozen, he gets put in that mold. It's like after an event, your emotional system goes into that freeze mode, and your body, you keep living life, but your emotional system is stuck. And then all of a sudden, when you come out of the mold, your emotional system feels like you're back at where you were. So, for example, with a war veteran, if they've been in a combat zone, let's say they come home and the war is over, or they're not in the war anymore, they might feel like everything's okay, but their emotional system could be stuck back in the war zone. So, some of that criteria of having PTSD would be feeling like you're back in that time, which we call flashbacks. People have nightmares. These flashbacks can happen at nighttime or during the day. There's hypervigilance, kind of feeling as though you can't, I like using the phrase, you can't turn the light off. The light's always on. Anxiety, depression, you're having problems interacting with people, problems feeling safe, having images of an event constantly kind of come through that you can't control. Other criteria includes avoiding anything that reminds you of the event. It also is trying to avoid, if you start avoiding the emotional dysregulation or the emotional distress you have, and you start to do things to avoid that, that's part of the criteria. So when you go see somebody for PTSD, or maybe, so be sure to make sure that they know about these criteria to go through the full spectrum. A lot of times, some of us can maybe have one or two of these symptoms. Let's say just, you saw a car accident happen at a certain intersection. And so the next time you come to that intersection, you might be a little jittery. That's completely normal. That probably will resolve. If it doesn't, go see someone, because sometimes there's stuff underneath that's been brewing, and an event like that in a time in your life could just trigger this kind of panic. And if you so you can have pieces of the criteria and not be diagnosed fully with PTSD. So don't be scared of those initials. It is a treatable disorder, and worth going in to talk to someone. So anybody can get PTSD. The statistics show that the actual median age is 23. Now, I was surprised to hear that number was so low. I was expecting that number to be higher, but this is the median age between 15 and 39 years. And that's because there's a lot of times a delayed onset of the PTSD symptoms, like I described with the Han Solo being frozen. A lot of times it doesn't come out till later. It's still PTSD. A lot of times the symptoms they call it symptom exaggeration. Over time, the further you get away from an event and it hasn't been what we call kind of resolved, the symptoms get worse, such as anxiety, depression, maybe social anxiety, maybe avoidance of certain things. All that over time can get worse. So let's say you had an event happen when you were 18 and you don't start feeling the effects of it till, say, you're 23. And I mean the mental effects till you're about 23. And then you start getting some, let's say, social anxiety. And by the time you're 30, you don't want to go anywhere. You don't want to go to the movies. You don't want to go to the grocery store. And you don't know why. Well, then you remember, oh, right, when I was 18, I was in the movies when, I heard about 9/11. I know I'm pulling back on that. But, but that memory tied with that fear and being in a public place and maybe feeling like you weren't safe, you know, could have triggered something like that. Um, so according to the National Institute of Health, some of their statistics show that 6 out of 10 men and 5 out of 10 women have at least one traumatic event in their life. And the reason why that's important is because pretty PTSD most of the time, I'm going to say, comes from a traumatic event. So 60% of men, 50% of women. And again, remember, this is just what's reported. Will you develop PTSD after a traumatic event? Not necessarily. The numbers actually show that 20% will develop diagnostic appropriate PTSD. So even though it might seem like a low number, it's, 20% is still worth taking care of and going in for some help to reduce these symptoms. Again, can PTSD show up anytime? Absolutely. It can also show up in pieces. You don't necessarily get all of these symptoms at one time. It could start with one symptom that gradually, kind of grows over time, and then another symptom comes in. So it's one of those diagnoses where, at least as a therapist, when I have had clients with PTSD, sometimes you can see all of the symptoms, but a lot of times you see pieces of it. And a lot of times people have just learned how to deal with it, and they don't understand that it's tied back to this event that maybe happened when they were 15. So it doesn't matter how far you are away from that 15-year-old age mark. You could be 70 and still be feeling the effects. But sometimes I think we justify it. We just say, oh, this is how it is. I just have to deal with it. And we learn, our bodies are miraculous, and that we do learn to adjust to what's going on in our bodies, even though, we don't have to. I use the example of, if you broke your foot and you don't go in for surgery, your foot will reattach itself to some level so you can use it. It might not attach formally, the bones won't attach properly. You can still use it, it'll still hurt to walk, but it's still usable. So is it worth, a lot of times we do that. We just get used to it and say, well, I can still walk. Well, even though walking funny messes up my spine, which messes up my alignment, which then now I have these headaches all the time, but that's okay, So if you feel like you might have PTSD, any of the symptoms or something you just can't shake, or memories that keep popping up that you just can't get rid of, even if they don't feel like they're a big deal, even if they don't feel as intense as somebody else, go go talk to someone, because we don't have to make it harder on ourselves just because we can say, well, they had it worse. I never went to war, so I don't deserve the criteria and diagnosis of PTSD. No, it's important for everybody. I've told many clients, like, why make it harder? We can choose to just deal with it, or, that management. How do I manage my stress? Well, I don't want to manage stress. If I had a choice, I want to get to the root of it so we don't feel as stressful, so we can kind of move through it as opposed to managing it. Same thing with PTSD. But when you do find a therapist, find one that you trust, find one that has experience in PTSD, and find someone who has modalities to treat it, but also knows how to go at your pace. So we don't ever want to just jump in and tackle all of these traumatic events at one time. Turns out that's not good for us. Turns out that's re-traumatizing. So as you're looking for therapy for this, consider looking for a therapist that has training in trauma, but even specifically EMDR or maybe even brain spotting, and who is comfortable at going at your pace and understanding where you are on that. If you think you might have PTSD or you are struggling with some of these symptoms we've talked about today from PTSD, feel free to reach out to us at connect@steadfastcc.com. We will also be posting about this on our blog, which is steadfastchristiancounseling.com. Also, be sure to follow us as we have exciting weekly, sometimes daily, but weekly updates on our Instagram page, Facebook, and YouTube. Looking forward to hearing from you all.